Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Just a little reflection back to U of T and control systems there, back to the young entrepreneurs. In my master's thesis, one of the things that I worked on, and this is going back to 1979, was actually working on automating the EPA mileage test on cars on a chassis dynamometer, and we worked on some linear simulators and some Kalman filters for those of you who care. But what was interesting at the time was we actually got some funding from the Ontario government, $10,000, to actually develop that and commercialize it, which was then sold off to a company. And off I went to Imperial Oil, to bustling downtown Sarnia, Ontario for a while, moved back to Toronto, and then was at Microsoft for many years. I've had the privilege of actually traveling around the world for many years and seeing what is happening in different countries, in different companies, large and small, to get a sense of how they're innovating and how they're incubating. And for the last couple of years, it's really been focused around artificial intelligence. And so, to some degree, what I've done is assembled a set of lessons about how to really make AI real. What do we know? What do we not know? Where am I seeing success? But we're also seeing many failures where companies are doing things that are not completing and not really going into production. So lots of experiments that are happening. And so this is really an assembly of all of those things. And so a place to start is really how are decisions made? When you're actually going to tackle a new project, a new engagement, a new technology, or even an incubation, how do we decide what technologies to use or what solutions to even go after? And so I need a quick framework which talks about two key concepts. The first one is around principles, and the other is around strategies. And the way to think about these as separate entities is that the principles are around behavior, and the strategies are around how you spend money, because that's where you invest. And when you think about those strategies, you can actually look at them in this sort of frame. A principle is we think open source is good, and you actually drive your behavior around that. But the strategy is then when you select specific products and you decide what you're going to do with open source and what you might not do. But that's how you start to spend money. And the way you spend money is really in this interesting framework around architecture. Because the notion of architecture is really thinking about constraining degrees of freedom. It's about shrinking the decision space. So you're starting to get into this conversation about what will I do and what will I not do? Are these durable assets? Are these fragile assets? Really in this sort of framework of OpEx and CapEx. And the notion of something that is durable, that'll last a long time, you may be investing sort of higher revenue in that. And something that is fragile, you may experiment with to learn, but you know that it's throwaway and you invest appropriately. And so when I talk to many startups and incubators, one of the questions I'll ask them is, what do you think the half-life of your technology is? And if the half-life is 6 months, you're in the fragile space. And if the half-life is in years, you're actually much more in that high investment, which is more of a capital return rather than just an investment at expense. People don't think about the sort of financial framework for these architectural discussions, but it turns out to be an incredibly important part. Now, if I frame that in the AI discussion, and many people bring this up about how good is it, how bad is it, can it do what it claims they can do. Firstly, AI is not real, is not new. AI, we've actually been having, this work has been going on for 40, 50, 60 years back to languages like Prolog and Lisp. Some of you may remember those. But even today, AI is not perfect. But the interesting thing is that AI is not imperfect. You can do some incredible things with it today. You can build some amazing solutions. Just walk outside in the hall and you'll see many of those. You can build real AI-based applications today. There are some super complicated things that AI can help with that are really long-term research-like projects. Don't focus on those. There are some amazing things that can be done in weeks, not even necessarily months or years, to think about it that way. But AI is also empowering and change. It's empowering for developers to learn how to innovate and do something different, do something that nobody else has been able to do before. But it's also about organizations transforming their business. It's about organizations doing different things. And the opportunity for organizations to transform is really brought about by the capabilities of AI. But more importantly, AI is about shaping society. It is probably going to be one of those interesting conversations about the role of AI in society and the impact that it can have, from the way work gets executed into the way we automate and instill bias into some systems. The essence of all of this is that AI is about augmenting human ingenuity. It's about making people better. And if you start off with that premise, you can start to do amazing things. As I sort of alluded to, AI is actually a catalyst to transformation. Let me define transformation, digital transformation. The first step of digital transformation is actually digitizing content that today is analog or not accessible. Using a video camera to recognize the movement of people, for example. Using proxy AI measures to actually measure things that were not really measurable. So the first thing is digitization. The next step is if you actually can digitize it, can you actually update the process and actually include something in the process? Because previously you had an analog hotspot. You had this beautiful process in your business, whether it was manufacturing, engineering, or customer service, and yet there was an analog hotspot where somebody had to write something down on a little piece of paper. And if digitization can change that, suddenly you've actually closed the loop on a process. But the third step of digitization and transformation is actually new and different processes, and that's where the innovation comes in, and the propensity of companies to actually change and do something different. But there's another important aspect of AI, which is AI at the edge. Because no matter what the communication infrastructure that you have or the power infrastructure that you have, there's always a possibility that the device at the edge, whether it's a car, a drone, an airplane, or a little device like this, could actually lose communication and has to operate at a standalone basis. So one of your core architectural assumptions as you build these solutions is what happens if I can't get to the cloud? Can I run the AI in close proximity in real enough time to the business process that it's adjusting? And how do you actually do that? Can you actually size the AI in a compact form so it runs as close as it can? Now, you've seen that in many cases with autopilots on an airplane. We've been living with that for a long, long time, where you have a device at the edge that's pretty sophisticated that can fly by itself. It can take off and land by itself. And so this notion of the edge is not new, but I see many designs being built today that are totally dependent on a 100% always connected mode. And you have to think about that as a mostly connected architecture. But the reality is it's not always connected. Transformation is also around making data-driven decisions. So if I have, in this example, the layout of a coffee shop, and I can actually track the people and the movement of the people. If I go to the manager of a particular coffee shop, and I say, love to have a chat with you, yesterday at 3 o'clock, can you tell me how many people were in your store? It actually turns out they have no clue. Do you know how many people were in the store not drinking coffee? No clue. Unless there's an analog hotspot, unless the manager wrote down on a little piece of paper at 3 o'clock that looked busy. But if we could put video cameras in those stores, and most of them have it, and you could actually track the movement of people through the store in this picture, I could actually give you the spatial occupation of the store. I could give you an animated heat map of the movement of people, which tables are occupied and when. What would you do with that information? Would you actually make a change? Do you make data-driven decisions in your company, or are they intuitive? Because it turns out that most store layouts are actually too intuitive, being done by somebody called a store designer. But in most cases, it's not data-driven. And one of the wonderful things about AI is it gives you data. But if you're not a data-driven business, me giving you more data to throw away is not a very useful activity. So one of the core elements of AI-driven business is, do you make these data-driven decisions? I love Nicole's conversation earlier about the telemetry coming back from the monitoring vest. Because that, previously you had telemetry going in and telemetry coming out, but nothing in the middle. And the business telemetry is exactly the same thing, because the telemetry that we've had on business systems up to this point had essentially been the purchase transaction. Somebody bought some stuff. So many units at such a price. That was the telemetry that we had. And it turns out that the purchasing cycle is much larger than that, and CRM systems were created to some degree to provide us with additional telemetry. But what's important is not only the purchase. What is important is the journey. It's the history and the patterns of behavior. Whether this is actually purchasing something online or a piece of automation equipment where you're measuring the vibration coming out of a motor or a valve or a pump. That telemetry and all that telemetry gives us the insight to start to build models and look for patterns and look for anomalies. So we've built, from an IT perspective, systems over years to do something called ETL, which was about cleansing the data, throwing away the data. And the things that you were throwing away were incredibly valuable. So one of the first lessons is don't throw anything away. You just haven't figured out its value yet. Because this telemetry and patterns of behavior is something that can actually be used and, in fact, optimized to your processes in some way. There's lots of different patterns of AI solutions. Some simple things like bots and agents that you start to see many of today. Object recognition, I'll show you some examples of that. The one of these that I really like is AI-assisted professionals. How can I make somebody in a call center more efficient by helping them understand what the problem is? How can I make a lawyer more efficient? I'm not sure they're going to bill any more, any less when I do that, but there's lots, because they're dealing with documents, how can I make a lawyer more efficient? Autonomous systems and the things that they do, whether it's arms or robots or cars or devices or trucks, there's lots of work being done there. But it turns out there's a huge opportunity mining information to make people better. One of the great examples is a company called ThoughtWire, actually based here in Toronto, that is actually looking at telemetry coming out of the ER, out of the emergency room, and looking at telemetry coming back. And their key goal, their sort of hypothesis of this system was reducing false positives on a code blue or a code red. What could they do? And so they built up this massive database that looks at the history of the telemetry of what is happening inside the ER, and then filtering that and making that available to the nurses and the physicians so that the alerts that they get are the ones that count. And this is all about telemetry and matching patterns and trying to understand it. But in the end, it's about making people better. It's about making the nurses better and making the physicians better to provide better service to the patients in that room in different ways. And so responsible AI comes back to this notion of augmenting and amplifying human ingenuity. When we talk about AI technically, and I'm not going to talk very much about that, people jump into these kinds of services, language recognition, object recognition. That layer is going to disappear pretty quickly. And it's going to be replaced by a layer of much richer services, which is decision-making services, correlation, detection, much higher level services, so that the underlying AI and the AI models are going to be hidden from most people, and they will consume these services as if they were calling any other web service available to them on the web, and really raising the bar and making these services available to everybody, rather than the data scientists that you're going to pay a lot of money from and that you've stolen from another company because there's just not enough people. And so this notion of the level of architecture is going to change dramatically. Let's look at knowledge mining. I'm sure many of you see this. It's a contract of some kind. And when that contract is established, let's say it's a response to an RFP and it's 800 pages. There's some poor lucky volunteer inside of the company whose job it is going to be to decompose that contract, to break it into its pieces, to look for the various clauses, to look for the special asks in there. How do you do that? Well, typically they sit down and read it. But if you look at those documents today, there's a bunch of declarative metadata that's in there, which typically includes the size, the document, the authors, the dates, and some other mechanical information. But it's nothing useful in terms of understanding the document. But what could happen if I actually digitized that document and then processed it through some pattern recognition systems, that it could start to identify business entities inside of that document? So these are synthetic rather than declarative. And these could be clauses like IP clauses or liability clauses or GDPR clauses. And those get annotated, put into a set of links. And so when I'm the lawyer reading this document and I want to see where GDPR is, I just go through a set of links. So I'm using the AI system and its ability to recognize patterns and entities to make the contract administrator better. So the essence of a lot of these things, as I said, is about making people better. This is a very simple application, but talk to any company. What do they do when they get an RFP? They sit down and read it. But AI can actually help you do that. It can help you be better and help you make your job better dramatically. But a big part of AI, what I called agile AI, is not about AI. It's about the business being agile. It's about the business being able to respond to change of weeks, not months and not years. And can you actually change the underlying business processes to be responsive to change like this? Because if the AI recognizes a pattern that is valuable, can you do something with it? And that is really going to be dictated by the propensity of the business to absorb change and deal with it. When we go back and look at some of the telemetry out of the cloud systems and look at AI consumption, this is one of the things that we see. It's called a trapezoid, but this is actually the telemetry coming back from what is called a proof of concept. We actually do some development, the consumption goes up, we continue with that experiment, and then it ends. I cannot tell you how many of we see of these proof of concepts that don't convert. So the question is, why do they not convert from being a proof of concept into something real providing value to the business? What are the constraints that are in there that is actually preventing us from doing that? So a couple of points about that. Every proof of concept has to have a hypothesis. What are we trying to prove or disprove? This is back to scientific method, your sort of high school science experiments. Does the experiment have a business owner? Is there actually an exit strategy from the experiment? So when I see these proof of concepts and I ask these questions, typically, not always, but typically I just get blank stares. Because it's an interesting technical exercise, the technical people love it, but in the end, it's actually missing the core business value. There's a great case study that actually came out of Microsoft Finance. And the goal of finance was to actually predict accounts receivable across all the operating entities around the world. Microsoft operates in over 100 countries. How can you actually predict accounts receivable every month and every quarter? It turns out the controller in a country goes and talks to the salespeople. They give him a projection. The controller puts judgment on it. He rolls it up to region. They put some judgment on it, sends it up to corporate. They put some judgment on it, and they come up with a monthly and quarterly prediction. But we got incredible history of these forecasts and actuals. So there was a hypothesis. Could I create a machine learning model that could look at the predictions versus the actuals, and could the AI system be better than people? So this system was actually put into production. Small team of 3 people, 6 weeks for the first cycle to prove that it was viable. And it turns out it is. It turns out that it's actually about 25% better. AI is 25% better than people because people put on judgment and AI looks at patterns. What's interesting is you have to learn the behavior of the controller in a particular country. You have to learn that in this country, this controller is optimistic, that country, they're pessimistic. But in aggregate, you're actually saving a huge amount of work because that whole roll-up of people adding judgment is gone because the AI system now looks at the patterns and it actually is more accurate than people. But the key thing about this is a business owner, hypothesis, and 6 weeks. So what are the core assets of AI then? The first one is models. Can you build a model that's reflective of your business? Some companies will develop models, some company will buy models. There'll be a great marketplace for models. They'll be incredibly valuable. Models will cost $500,000 or $1 million because they really are about recognizing the patterns of behavior. But models are trained by data. And so even no matter how much data you've got, you don't have enough. There is data out there that can augment what you've got today. It can be Twitter data, Facebook data, web data, data through your value chain, your supply chain, from your partners, from your customers. The training data is what's going to build those systems and build them in a reliable way. We know that great AI needs great data, lots of it. But is that data useful and is that data valuable? We know that data is not perfect. And in fact, data modelers are a real problem because they will never finish modeling. They will just go on modeling forever. And you'll hear from a lot of the tech companies, you need to fix your data estate. And that never ends. Because although the data is not perfect like AI, it actually is not imperfect, and you have the data today to do something. Try it. Do it. Find out what you have and what you don't have. But if you wait for the data modelers to finish, never happen because they never actually finish. And so we spent years gathering data, sometimes throwing it away, sometimes keeping it. But the reality is, it's time to move from data to knowledge. How much do you actually understand about the patterns of behavior of your systems, whether they're your sales systems or manufacturing systems or supply chain systems or retail systems? How much real understanding do you have about the patterns of behavior of those systems today? And the answer in general is very little. You have lots of data, but not that much knowledge. And the companies that are developing these knowledge systems of understanding the expectations of behavior Those are going to be the ones that are actually going to change. And so what comes out of this is a new ecosystem, a marketplace for models and a marketplace for data, that you can buy and sell these things, these assets. So you'll have some yourselves, you'll buy some, you'll sell some in this incredibly valuable marketplace that happens. But how much do you really need? So one of the questions is, if you're actually going to do pattern recognition in pictures, if you're going to try and look at images and understand the world's problems, it's really hard. Let me give you an example. I'm going to show you a picture in a moment, and you need to tell me whether you see a food or an animal. So think about what your brain's going through when you see these pictures. Can you actually recognize a chihuahua from a blueberry muffin? On the other hand, the other side, which is actually much harder, can you recognize a parrot from guacamole? Now, if you think about this unconstrained problem, it's really hard. What your brain is going through is really complex. So how much data do you actually need? So we did a project with a company in Denmark that was doing bridge maintenance on concrete. And the question was, how much data do we need to be able to identify concrete failure? So the first thing we can do is constrain the problem. There are 3 kinds of concrete failure: bacteria, cracks, and rust. And if those are the only things that I've got to use, how many photographs do I need to train the model? Turns out 1,100. Most people think you need millions of pictures. But if you can constrain the data space, it's actually pretty efficient. But in the end, it's all about recognizing the pattern. And there's a pattern underlying this picture that I'll show you in a moment. And sometimes we actually lose the forest for the trees. You get so into the data that you don't actually recognize the pattern that is there. And that's the essence of AI. It's recognizing the right patterns and iterating around them to really get this much deeper understanding. Unfortunately, bias is a huge issue. Bias in the nature of the data that you've got, and bias by business model. I'll give you a quick example of bias in a business model. Say we're a bank and we do loan origination on mortgages. But we found that married couple in their 40s with 2 kids and a dog are really great people to pay back their mortgages. And so our bank has slowly drifted towards giving mortgages to married couple with 2 kids and a dog. Now, if I use that data to train a model, you know what kind of people it's going to recommend. But if I happen to be a single mother with 1 kid and no dog, that system is actually going to reject my application, even though I might be the best candidate. And it's going to reject it because of systemic discrimination in the model. And one of the key things that we've got to work through is something called unconscious bias. Each and every one of us has unconscious bias. There's some great material that's been written on this. And it's unconscious bias around the environment that you live in and the content that you build. And one of the great solutions around dealing with unconscious bias is actually having diverse teams. Diverse teams at different age, different styles, different thought processes, different cultures. That's one of the easiest ways to get rid of bias, is through that. So where do we start? We did some work, and we looked at there are a couple of dimensions of trying to decide where companies should start. The first thing is the analytical profile of the company. Do you have a data warehouse and some spreadsheets? It puts you at the bottom of the list, or are you really thinking about deep insight at the top? There's a second one, which is around transformational change, which is, what is your digital profile? How open are you to the propensity to change, from nothing at the bottom to transformational at the top? And when you put those all together, we found sort of 4 categories of data. One of them is about technology capabilities. The other 3 are around strategy, organization, and culture that really get to the deep understanding. So when I talked about data-driven decision-making, that sits in the cultural side. So when you put that together into an AI maturity model, it's actually a great opportunity for companies to evaluate themselves. And we did some work in Europe, 270 companies in Europe, to actually have a look at their behavior. And when we look at the distribution across these models, you actually see 4% at the top, 28% is doing well, and about 70% is at that bottom tier, having no clue what they're doing and are really just trying. And so the real opportunity is to address that market. How do you actually bring the people at the bottom and get them to start? That's actually the real opportunity. In order to do that, one of the key aspects is this principled approach, which is, to what degree do you actually understand the ethical risks that are attached to AI? And some of those risks can be around bias. Some of them can be around fairness. My banking example that I gave you is around fairness. Some of them are around privacy and security. So privacy and security is just one of these 6 elements. If you think about GDPR and all the work you had to do for GDPR, privacy and security is just one small element of that. And so there are a couple of themes that come out of this. We used to say that every company is a software company. That was so yesterday. Every company is an AI company. Whether you like it or not, you're an AI company. You just haven't figured it out yet, or you're on that path. But AI is going to impact everybody in some way. No AI strategy is not a strategy. Every company has to have an AI strategy of some kind. Determine your maturity, which will tell you where to start and how to sort of progress. But start writing your AI manifesto today. Because every company, whether you're a small company or a large public company, someone's going to ask you, what do you believe about AI? What are you going to do with my data? How are you going to aggregate? Is it anonymous? And all the questions that we're asking today. So every company needs to understand their position relative to AI in that AI manifesto. So a couple of quick principles. There's insight everywhere. Go find it inside of your company. It's actually there. Innovate in line of sight of your business. Don't innovate because it's fun. Innovate to move the business forward because the opportunities are actually huge. Have a data strategy, but don't wait for it to be perfect. You can actually do it today with the assets that you've got. You can actually create value with what you've got today, whether it's your processes, your people, or your data. You can actually build models or buy models, but you have a lot of existing assets that can be augmented with the other things that are out there. Start where your customers are as the right point as the entry point. How do you make your customers better? How do you make your products better? How do you make your services better in different ways? Start quickly. I cannot say this sort of more often. Be agile, start quickly, and improve continuously. If you think AI is a waterfall where you're going to have 20 people work on a project for a year, you will die. It just won't work. You have to do it in this highly iterative way. Unfortunately, I see many companies starting with the technology, but it actually is not about the platform, it's about the scenario. So identify the scenarios before you make the decisions about what technology you're going to use, because technologists tend to fall in love with the technology and not necessarily the thing that it's supposed to do. You have to do this inside of this framework of ethics and responsible AI to be able to do that. But one of the single most important things is do not do anything that might deprecate the brand. Because we've seen this happen already. Bad behavior can deprecate your brand incredibly quickly and destroy value that you spend years creating. A final example. Imagine you're sight impaired and you're trying to navigate through an airport. Remember, airports change. Doors change, escalators are out of service. There's all these things that happen. How do you do that? And there's this amazing company down in San Diego called Era that solved this in an incredibly interesting way by putting people at the center and by deciding what AI can do as opposed to how people can help. So they have 3 tiers to their application. The first thing is you load an application on a device. It actually has geolocation, has geomaps. It can kind of give you a sense of where you are. But it can also read. So it can read a menu. It can read the temperature on an oven, some simple things that we take for granted, but if you're sight impaired, kind of difficult. That's the first step. The second thing that they've done, because that's not good enough, because the world changes, is if you saw in that pictures, in the photograph earlier, there's put on a pair of glasses that actually has a camera in it. That camera goes into the device, and now I can use AI to actually analyze the space in real time. But what happens? Imagine I'm in an airport, and I'm actually trying to go up the escalator. How do I know when to get off? It's a really hard problem for somebody who's sight impaired. You've got to use a stick, or you've got to have a sense of it, or you're counting, or something. But these guys have done something amazing, because when you're sight impaired and you're in a place that is foreign, or a place that is changing, you can actually call a friend. And through the device, somebody remotely can see what you're seeing and can articulate and label the space for you. So when you're going up the escalator, all they have to say is you're coming towards the end, 3, 2, 1. And it's this wonderful amalgamation of technology and people. And the goal of it is to actually make people better. So here's actually where we stand. Solving the opportunity is really about these 4 things. Responsible innovation, not innovating for the fun of it, not incubating for the fun of it, but responsible innovation, bound with trust and ethics, but looking at the future of how people work and looking at the societal impact. But when you take the integral of all of that, you can come up with a sustained and inclusive economic growth. And when I put that into the local context, successful AI technology is really dependent on three organizations: the government, the developers of technology, and the consumers of technology. And those three together is actually what's going to make this successful. And if the thing we look for is sustained and inclusive economic growth, we all have a responsibility to do that, and to do that in an incredibly important way, because with AI, we can make the world better. Thank you.